Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating cultural debate raised by our source material. We're going to be unpacking how modern reading habits are judged, categorized, and, let's be honest, often shamed. Specifically, we're taking a deep dive into the massive double standards surrounding the romance and romantasy genres. I mean, why exactly is the media that women consume judged by a completely different set of rules than the media men consume? It's a super compelling question, and breaking this topic down actually reveals a whole lot about how society views audience agency.
Okay, so let's jump right into the inciting incident from our source material. Picture this. An avid reader, someone who regularly reviews fantasy and romance books on TikTok, posts a picture of a scene from a book she was reading. It was this beautifully written, highly emotional, and intense moment between two characters. And crucially, it was not explicit at all. Yet, a man left this exact comment on her video. Women are basically reading porn. This one single, totally dismissive comment perfectly encapsulates a much wider, systemic view of women's reading habits. It literally takes an entire hobby, an entire genre of literature, and just reduces it to a punchline. But, as our source material argues, this critique completely falls apart the second we apply that exact same logic to mainstream media.
So that brings us to Section 1, the media double standard, prestige television versus pornography. To really illustrate this, the source brings up a perfect comparison: Game of Thrones. Now, this is a male-oriented franchise that is absolutely loaded with explicit sex and violence. Yet, it's categorized as prestige storytelling, right? It gets heavily praised for its complex plot and deep political intrigue. Now, compare that to a typical 400-page romance novel written for women. That novel also has intense world-building, incredible character arcs, and deep political conflicts. But because it contains romantic and sexual content, suddenly it gets mocked, labeled as shallow, and completely dismissed as basically porn. The contrast is just staggering. Let's look just a little closer at the acclaimed side of that comparison for a second. Game of Thrones featured explicit sex scenes in almost every single episode. It had graphic violence, full nudity, sexual assault depicted on screen, and it literally used brothels as major plot locations. And honestly, the source books by George R.R. Martin go into even more detail. But here's the thing. Nobody reduces that entire sprawling series to just its sex scenes. The source rightly points out that men regularly consume male-oriented fantasy books, action movies, and video games that are packed with heavy sexual content, and they do it without anyone ever questioning their taste or shaming them for simply watching porn. And that brings us to the central thesis of our source material. The only real difference here is who is consuming it. When men consume media that includes sexual content, it's considered completely normal, acceptable, or just viewed as a realistic part of a much larger story. But the second women enjoy similar content in a book, that sexual content magically becomes the only thing society focuses on. Men get to enjoy media with sex without their entire taste being questioned, while women apparently do not. All right, moving on to Section 2, Anatomy of a Romance Novel, Dismantling the Myth. Let's step away from the TV comparisons for a minute and actually do the math here, because our source points out a pretty glaring truth. The critics who claim romance books are basically porn usually share one major thing in common. They have literally never read one. Because they haven't actually read the material, they end up judging an entire complex novel based on a single, out-of-context social media excerpts. They see one spicy quote on TikTok and just assume, yep, that represents the entirety of the text. But when we break down the actual data of a typical 500-page romance or romantasy novel, their entire argument just shifts. Think about it. You've got about 470 pages entirely dedicated to plot, dialogue, intricate world building, major conflict, and character growth. The explicit content, or the spice, makes up maybe 10 to 30 pages of that entire volume. That is a tiny, tiny fraction of the book. And yet, critics completely ignore the massive portion of the story just to obsess over that little sliver of spice, basically deciding that this tiny fraction defines the whole shebang. Because they get so hyper-focused on that small fraction, the source highlights exactly what these critics completely miss. They don't see the 200 pages leading up to that one scene, the pages where characters first met, navigated massive obstacles together, and built genuine emotional intimacy. They miss the incredibly intricate magic systems that easily rival those serious fantasy series recommended by men. They completely ignore the complex court politics, the epic battles, and a level of deep emotional complexity that, honestly, sometimes surpasses traditional literary fiction. These are fully realized novels that require immense skill and planning from the author. You see, a fundamental misunderstanding critics have is this weird idea that romance is somehow a distraction from a real story. But actually, scratch that. Romance isn't the absence of plot. It is the plot. Just like romantic subplots in mainstream blockbuster movies or critically acclaimed shows, which, by the way, usually avoid this level of scrutiny, the relationship in these books is the engine of the narrative. It drives the story forward, it creates the central conflict, it raises the stakes, and it adds immense emotional weight to everything that happens. It just happens to be the main plot instead of a subplot, and the source argues that society wrongly devalues it for that exact reason. Let's dig a little deeper with Section 3, the root cause, the issue of agency and control. So we've established the what, the mathematical and structural hypocrisy of this media critique. Now let's pivot to the deeper sociological why that the source presents. Why does this double standard even exist in the first place? I really want you to critically consider this for a second. Why is society at large so deeply uncomfortable with women exploring romance, desire, and intimacy through fiction? Remember, men do this constantly through video games, movies, and fantasy books without experiencing any kind of societal backlash. So why the intense reaction when women do the exact same thing? Well, our source suggests the answer boils down to female sexual agency. Romance and romantesty books are not just stories. They actually represent a stark break from societal expectations. Historically and culturally, there's always been this expectation for women to be entirely to not openly have preferences, but reading a book that heavily centers female pleasure, female perspectives, and female choices, that totally shatters that expectation. It proves that women have agency, and honestly, that makes a certain demographic very, very uncomfortable. The source ultimately concludes that the criticism isn't actually about the content at all. It's not about the quality of the writing, and it certainly isn't about protecting women from inappropriate themes. The argument is that the real issue is a deep-seated discomfort with women openly expressing what they find attractive, declaring exactly what they want in a relationship, and actively seeking out content that caters strictly to their own pleasure and perspective. When you look at it in this light, calling it porn is really just presented as a tool used to shame women and regain a sense of control. Which brings us to our final part, Section 4, Reading Without Shame, Exposing the Hypocrisy. So, as we wrap things up today, how do we actually dismantle this double standard in the real world? Thankfully, our source provides a highly practical strategy for this exact situation. Next time someone tries to reduce a 500-page fantasy romance to just porn, just walk them through these steps. First, ask them if they've ever watched Game of Thrones or read mainstream fantasy. Second, ask if they play video games that contain sexual elements. When they inevitably say yes to consuming media with explicit moments, move right to step 3. Calmly remind them that the only actual difference between their media and yours is that yours is written specifically for women. It exposes the double standard immediately. The absolutely crucial takeaway from this source material is super simple. Women are allowed to enjoy romance and sexuality in their reading. Full stop. You do not need anyone's permission, and you certainly do not need anyone's approval to keep enjoying the books you love. There is absolutely nothing shameful about reading beautifully written stories full of plot, emotion, character development, and yes, even intimacy. We're going to leave you with this final thought to carry with you. When we see genres mocked and when we see reading habits shamed, we really have to look past the surface-level critiques and ask the deeper question. Is the real problem ever actually the content itself? Or is the problem simply who that content is written for? Next time you hear a genre being dismissed, keep this explainer in mind and always question the biases hiding right behind the criticism. Thanks so much for learning with us today.